Hello and welcome to the preview episode of Trek Untold, the Star Trek-inspired podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, my fandom, and what this new show is all about. I remember first watching Star Trek The Next Generation back when it was originally on. I wasn't alive when the original show aired in the 60s, but I was almost 3 when Next Gen debuted. And back then, it was on channel WPIX-11 here in New York City, and that's also how I later learned about the original series thanks to their marathons that they would run during holidays that I saw when I was growing up. I had the original Galoob figures from Next Gen, which I must have gotten for my birthday when they first came out, because I vividly remember having them in time for Christmas one year. In fact, they were guarding my milk and cookies for Santa with their phasers drawn to make sure that nobody dared to eat them. A few years and a few holidays later, I got the first wave of the Playmates Next Gen figures once they got the license. As I got older, my interest in Trek faded, and by the time Deep Space Nine and Voyager first aired, I wasn't really paying much attention at all. I would peek a few episodes of Voyager, and I remember watching the Deep Space Nine finale but having no idea what was happening because, frankly, I hadn't watched it in years and had no idea what the major storyline was at that point. I saw some of the Next Gen movies on VHS, but it just really wasn't my thing anymore. That, of course, would change. So fast forward to today. I'm the editor-in-chief of nerdnewstoday.com, which is a website and YouTube channel that's been around since 2011. Before I was doing that, I was The Fight Nerd, which was a site and channel I started 2 years earlier that covered mixed martial arts, UFC, kickboxing, that kind of thing, all the other combat sports. And eventually I retired from that in 2016 after getting into some other parts of the sport and changing my focus essentially to do more production and that kind of stuff. But Nerd News Today kept on and has continued to grow and change and evolve and become one of the passion projects that a lot of my energy has gone into. On that channel, we cover comics, toys, movies, video games, all sorts of other things that I like. Devoting my energy to that has meant learning more about franchises I've obsessed about already, such as Ghostbusters, and things I was never into as much, like Firefly. But it also meant reconnecting to shows and movies that I used to be into, but fell out of love with. Now, when I said Star Trek wasn't my thing for a while, that's not entirely true. I can remember watching reruns of it late at night, again on Channel 11, or other channels that had it, and really liking it, but not to the point that it's become today. Really, what changed me and got me back into Star Trek completely was coming into contact with the toys again. I mentioned them earlier and the vivid memories I had of them as a kid. And as part of Nerd News Today, and frankly just because I like going to them, I attend a lot of comic conventions. I would always see loads of the old Star Trek figures in boxes, typically for dirt cheap. Vendors just can't get rid of these things. New York Comic Con 2012 is where it all began, because on that final day of that fateful show, I was rummaging through one of those vendors' bins of cheap toys, and I kept finding all these great Star Trek figures. And a lot of them are characters I remembered, a lot of them are characters I never even saw before, but most of them were toys I didn't have. I ended up coming home that day, spending about $30, but picking up about a dozen figures in package. I'm talking about Tasha Yar, Picard from All Good Things, Barclay, Q, a bunch of others I can't remember right now, but it was a lot. My other nerddom is collecting action figures from all sorts of franchises and things that I like, but that day in particular reopened a door that had been closed shut for years. As a kid, my Trek love really kind of faded away because I got into other things like X-Men, Power Rangers, pro wrestling, and other obsessions, so I missed out on most of those Playmates figures for years. And here I was now, over 20 years later, scooping up all the figures I never got, and man was I impressed by them. So naturally, it led me to wanting to watch the shows again to see what I missed out on, and of course from there, it was only a matter of time before I became a reborn Trekkie. Jumping way ahead to today, we're back on Nerd News Today. We do a weekly toy review series of Star Trek figures called Trek Back Tuesday, and my obsession to collect the figures has gone into all of the figures throughout the years. In fact, more recently I started getting into the prototypes, but that's going to be a story for another day. So now I'm not just an obsessed Star Trek fan, though. I still have other things I'm passionate about, and one of those things is classic movies. When I'm not working on Nerd News Today or my other projects, I'm a filmmaker and work in post-production. I've got a few documentaries on Amazon Prime, I had a few at some TV distribution deals, and they've been streaming in all sorts of other places here and there. A few of these movies have gotten some pretty good eyes on them and some decent acclaim. I attribute a lot of my education to what I know about making movies due to reading comics and knowing history. My TV is always set on a few select channels, and that's either Heroes and Icons or BBC America for Star Trek, Cartoon Network because I gotta have my gumball. But most of the time, it's actually on Turner Classic Movies. There's so much new stuff out there in theaters and on demand, and many of it, quite frankly, is just mediocre eye candy, and with time being the most valuable thing that we can ever actually get back. I like to spend a lot of time learning about the roots and inspirations that today's directors and actors reference and pull from in their work, so it's a real masterclass that you get to watch with your basic cable TV subscription plan. Truth be told, I never fancied myself as a podcaster either. even though I had one while I was the Fight Nerd, which lasted about 6 months. And I've been a guest on plenty of them, but again, as the Fight Nerd, I did pick up a lot of valuable skills that I'm bringing over today. And one of those skills is the ability to interview people, something I really hadn't done up until I was the Fight Nerd. Those skills have been put to good use in my filmmaking, of course, as well, because I spend a lot of time interviewing people and trying to connect to them, to get answers out of them, and just ultimately to get some sort of information that I want to pull to use in my work. Now, of course, making a documentary is totally different from doing a podcast, because in the documentary, I'm not the one on camera talking, but here in this podcast, I got to ramble on and on for a while, and you've got to listen. So what inspired me to actually pursue a podcast? Well, you're not going to believe this one, but it's actually Gilbert Gottfried. No, not directly. He didn't come to me to dream and tell me, you gotta make a podcast. I'm never going to do that voice again. But I found out that he had a podcast a few years back thanks to Leonard Maltin's podcast. And soon I was hooked on Gilbert's amazing Colossal podcast. If you're not familiar with that show, what they do is each week they get these great guests that are often character actors from across cinematic history, stage, screen, theater, and quite frankly, a lot of times I have no idea who the heck they are. But as soon as they start discussing their work, I recognize them immediately. They have all these great stories that don't get heard quite often because they're not the big A-listers, and that's what kind of made me start to think about Star Trek. Every episode of Star Trek is filled with character actors, some established and well into their careers doing major roles, others just starting out and would go on to do bigger things. But for their appearance on Star Trek, they'd be lucky just to have one line. Aside from the actors, there's the directors, stunt performers, and all of the behind-the-scenes crew that makes Star Trek what it is. So that's where the idea came to make Trek Untold, to, in a terrible pun, go beyond the stars when we talk about Star Trek. Trek Untold is a weekly guest-driven podcast that takes a deep dive into each person we chat with. I wanted to make a podcast that celebrates these people who have contributed so much to not only Star Trek, but television, cinema, and theatrical history. I like to call Trek Untold a cross between Inside the Actor's Studio with a dash of the Dick Cavett Show, sprinkled with Star Trek. The emphasis on this podcast series is Trek, but we delve into the entire career of these people, who they worked with, and how they do the work they do. I've already recorded a bunch of episodes for this show, and some of the stories you're going to hear are funny, fascinating, and informative. You're going to get something out of all these episodes, even if you don't know who these people are at first. For those interested in being actors in particular, or directors, or involved in the process of performing, production, or post-production, really anything on that side of the industry, you're going to hear some great insight that you can certainly use in your profession, and I think some of it you could use in your life too. The first episode is going to be debuting here on May 7th, 2020, so I urge you to please subscribe today so you can be notified when that first episode officially drops. In the meantime, I'd also be grateful if you could follow us on social media to stay up to date for that official launch. So check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Trek Untold, and that's all one word with no spaces. We're going to hopefully have some merch on launch day as well as some other things, so the best way to find out about those is to be following us on social media. You can also learn more about what I do and watch our Trek Back Tuesday toy review series by visiting youtube.com/nerdnewstoday. So thank you for listening to this preview episode of Trek Untold, and I really can't wait for you to hear the show itself. It's been a real treat and privilege for me to do these interviews so far, and I hope Star Trek fans can really dig into these and hear some stories they never heard before. So until next time, and our first episode officially beams down to whatever device you're using to listen to this, I'm Matthew from Trek Untold, and remember, fortune favors the bold. See you soon.